Okay, we're starting to record. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professors Jeffrey Zax of the Economics Department, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And
So, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an unusual pleasure. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to talk to you all, and I'm grateful for it. I have a feeling that this may not be a particularly controversial presentation, and I'm sorry about that. But perhaps you'll find some way to argue with me. You can see the title, Why the Living Wage, and for that matter, a higher minimum wage is a bad idea. So living wages and minimum wages to me are, functionally the same. The idea is to legislate wages that would be above what we would experience otherwise as market clearing wages. And although they go by different names, as far as I'm concerned, they're essentially the same policy. So that's why they're part of the same talk. All right, so there are two related problems. One is that some people have low standards of living. That's undeniable. Another is that some people are paid low wages. That's also undeniable. And the living wage, or the minimum wage, is an attempt to address the first problem by offering a solution to the second problem. Fundamentally, that's where things go wrong. So, there are some people who get low wages. We've agreed to that. There are some people who have low living standards. We agree with that as well. But those are two separate problems. And many people who get low wages are actually in households that do not have low living standards. So, for example, many people working at the minimum wage are teenagers who live within their family's household, their family's household, and their contribution to the family's well-being, their financial contribution to the family's well-being, is not really important. So, there are some people who have low wages themselves, but they don't have low living standards because they live in households that are better off. There are also people who have low living standards because they're not at work. Then there's this third group that both have low wages and low living standards. And any attempt to manipulate wages is going to have an impact on the living standards only of this group right here. That is, if you increase, as we're considering doing, if we increase the minimum wage for all workers, those who live in households that are already well off, they will benefit, but unnecessarily in some important sense. That is, they were already living reasonably well. Moreover, if we raise the minimum wage, we're not going to affect those who have low living standards but are not working, so they don't get helped. The minimum wage is only going to address, or only going to affect, people in this group who have both issues, low wages and low living standards. So the first problem with a legislative minimum on what people can get paid is that it's what we call badly targeted. Badly targeted. That is, of those who we want to affect, a relatively small proportion will be affected, and of those who are affected, a relatively large proportion we don't want to affect. So, the policy is badly targeted. That's the first thing that's wrong with it. So, then, for those people to whom it might be appropriately targeted, that is, for those who do have low wages and low standards of living, then we've got to ask, does that policy even work for them? And the answer is no, and that's because it's not based on any kind of coherent understanding of why wages are low in the first place. That is, ordinarily, if you want to treat the disease and not the symptom, you need to know what the disease process is. In this case, we have a symptom. People are getting low wages. But in order to make them better off, we have to understand why their wages are low in order to be able to address the question of whether or not we can permanently improve that. And so the proposal to legislatively alter the minimum wage isn't based on a coherent understanding of why wages are low in the first place, and doesn't have a coherent theory of what the consequences of raising the minimum wage would actually be. So, as we said, the living wage first doesn't work for those who themselves have low wages but are in households that are well off. It doesn't work for those who have low living standards and don't work. For those who have both low wages and low living standards, that is, for those who presumably are relying mostly on their own incomes to support themselves, and their incomes are low, and so their living standards are low, there's two reasons why their wages might be low. One is that they're being exploited. And the other is They aren't especially skilled. Yes.
Oh, please. Yes.
Boy, this is a very elaborate presentation context. Very impressive. Yeah.
Shattering question, right?
Go ahead.
My question is assuming this third group, there has to be a correlation with low pay and low living standards, correct? There's a correlation between the two as opposed to there not being a correlation.
If there's anyone you would care about, it would be those people who, despite working relatively hard, can't earn enough to sustain the standard of living that we think of as adequate. Thank you very much. That is, at least as far as the minimum wage is concerned. You might also, there are clearly people whose standard of living is low and whose standard of living might be low enough that we think it's unacceptable, and they're not at work. Well, we may want to address them, but we can't address them through a minimum wage proposal because they aren't working. If we raise the minimum wage, that doesn't help them very much. So the only group that is potentially helpable, if that's a word, the only group that you can potentially assist through a minimum wage program, the only group who you could potentially assist and who you would want to assist is those who are working but don't earn enough to maintain an appropriate standard of living. That's the point, okay? Good, thank you. Now, so, if we want those who are working to have an adequate standard of living, the first question is, why, even though they're working, don't they have an adequate standard of living? And the answer to that is, of course, the superficial answer is, well, even though they're working, their wages are low. And there's no question that people work at low wages. So if you work at the current minimum wage, if you work a full-time year, your income still doesn't get you above the poverty line. If the poverty line is a line that we want to take seriously, then we have to confess, we have to admit that people who work, even if they work very hard at the minimum wage, are not going to exceed the poverty line. So if we say to ourselves, we would like to have a society where most people, everyone, has a good shot at being above the poverty line, people who work at the current minimum wage don't have that shot. All right, so you could legitimately care about them. But then you got to ask the question, why are their wages low? There's two possibilities. One is they're not getting paid what they deserve. They're being exploited. The other is they are getting paid what they deserve. They just aren't very productive. Well, do employers ruthlessly exploit their employees? And the answer is sometimes. Sure, it happens. In Colorado, when was the Homestake Massacre? Wasn't that the name of it? Sometime in the 20s where, what was it? Ludlow, yeah.
1906.
Good. I'm glad somebody here actually knows the history, right? Well, it's hard to look at that experience and say, oh, we can always trust employers to do the right thing. In that case, they brought in Pinkerton guards and they executed or killed a large number of their workers, right? That's not acceptable behavior. Now, fortunately, we've moved beyond that, right? We don't seem to see that very often, but at the same time, it's still possible for employers to behave in ways that are only possible because they aren't restrained by regulation or the power of the market. So in a town where there's only one big employer, that employer's got power and could behave in ways that we wouldn't think of as appropriate. If a worker is sufficiently powerless, so for example, if you're an illegal immigrant and you don't feel that you can safely access the administrative procedures we have to protect you from inappropriate labor personnel management, you can be exploited. There's no question about it. And so are there people out there who are living in containers, in bunk beds and containers and working 12 hours a day and having their wages withheld to pay for bogus charges that the employers are imposing on them? The answer is probably yes. That probably does happen in Colorado. It's probably not often, not common. We don't hear a lot about it. And second, the minimum wage is not going to fix that. If you've got 16 workers already who are living in a container and are being ruthlessly exploited, telling the employer that you got to pay him more when he's already not paying them what he should now is not really going to help. If they're being exploited, the right way to deal with that is to directly address the exploitation through enforcing the fair labor laws and so forth. Minimum wages are only going to be secondarily help those who are being paid little because they're being exploited. The other way you can get paid little is if your skills are low. Now, is it possible that someone's skills could be so limited that $7 an hour is all they're worth? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes. Roughly speaking, over 10 million workers don't have a high school diploma. That's almost 8% of the civilian labor force. This is harder to get at, but roughly, one estimate at least is that 20% of Americans read below the level needed to earn a living wage. That is, they don't have the productive capacity that would make them worth enough to an employer to pay them what would be necessary to allow them to sustain themselves at a higher standard of living. So, if you're getting low, so first, I guess what I'm asserting here is, first, unfortunately, there are workers in our economy whose skills are so limited that $7, $8 an hour is really all they're worth to an employer. And you can see there may even be a fair number of them. Now, so here's the problem. For this group of people who are getting paid low wages because that's what their productivity is, a minimum wage or a living wage is basically requiring the employer to lie to himself about how valuable the worker is. It's requiring the employer to say, your work is worth $7 an hour, but I'm going to pay you 10. Now, that's an imbalance that is very hard to sustain. Bad things happen when employers are forced to pay wages that are too high. First thing they're going to say is, I'm sure your life would be better if I paid you 10, but you're only worth 7 to me, and if I pay you 10, my life is going to be substantially worse. I'm losing $3 for every hour you work for me, and the truth is, nothing obligates me to have you work for me. That is, I have business decisions to make, and if those business decisions are constrained by a requirement that I pay you more than you're worth, I could do that, or I could choose not to have you work for me. That's all. So the first response you would expect is employers will reduce employment. The second possible response is, well, you say, all right, for this job I have to pay $10. The person currently in this job is only worth $7 an hour. One choice I have is to simply not have the work done. But another choice I have is to retain the job, but not the worker. This particular worker in this job can't generate $10 worth of value, and so I can't pay them $10 worth of value. However, if I release this worker and retain the job, I might be able to find a higher skilled worker. I mean, now that I'm offering $10 an hour for this job, I might be able to find a worker whose work is actually worth $10 an hour. So, again, the first response to a wage that's forced to be too high would be to reduce employment. The second would be to replace low-skilled workers with higher-skilled workers. And you notice, are we getting close to our goal? And the answer is no. If our goal was to help those who are working at low wages have a higher living standard, this first response isn't going to do that, because those people are, instead, you're going to say, all right, we will pass a law saying you used to get $7 an hour, now you're going to get $10 an hour, and the employer says, instead, this person isn't going to have a job at all. Well, you can see, if we invoke this first response, if we provoke this first response, we're not getting the outcome we wanted. Similarly, if we provoke the second response, once again, we're not getting the outcome we wanted. Under the second response, employers are again going to relieve themselves of their low productivity workers and replace them with the high productivity workers. If our intent was to help the low productivity workers, we failed. They don't have that job. That job may still be there, but it's not being filled by them.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. All right. Third, you can tell the employer to increase the wage from $7 to $10 or whatever it is you want to do, but that's not the only component. That's not all there is to the employer cost for having an employee. And one thing an employer can do is simply compensate by reducing the other components of employee compensation. So, for the most part, $7 minimum wage workers are not getting much in the way of benefits. But if they are, and you say, all right, the minimum wage has got to go up to $9 to $10, the first thing the employer is going to do is say, okay, I'm going to spend $2 or $3 per hour less on uniforms or food allowances, or I'm going to cut back on the 15-minute breaks that you get twice a day, or I'm going to clean the employee bathroom once every 2 weeks instead of once every 2 days. There are a whole variety of other costs of employment that the employer can cut back on in order to recoup the increase in the minimum wage. And if the employer does that, well, then the worker really isn't any better off. At least the worker still got their job, but they're not really any better off. More of their compensation is coming to them in the form of wages, but less is coming to them in the form of what other benefits they might receive from employment, and so their situation isn't improved. I think I'm going to need that cursor back. There we go. Thank you. And the worst of this is, over the long run, what's an employer going to do? An employer is going to invest in technology. That is, as workers of a particular skill become more expensive, it becomes easier to replace them, or more attractive to replace them, with technology. So, for example, if, as many minimum wage workers are, if you're working in a fast food restaurant, you're working in a Wendy's or a Domino's or a Subway or whatever it is, right now they have a production process. That is, they've got, in their restaurant, they've got stations, and they need someone manning the deep fryer, and they need someone manning the beverages, and someone manning the cash register, whatever the functions are. And for those kinds of restaurants, the way they're currently configured, they probably need, they have 4 stations and they need 4 people, and they're kind of stuck. If you force them to pay those people more, they still need 4 people for the moment. But if you say, all right, you're stuck, your current technology requires you to have 4 people to make this restaurant work. We're going to make you pay all those people more. The employer says, you know what, I'll do that for the moment because it's hard for me to reconfigure the way my restaurant works. But over time, the equipment in my restaurant's going to wear out, I'm going to need to replace it and so forth. And as I move down into the future, and I move in the direction of having to replace the equipment in my restaurant anyhow, I'm going to move in that direction with an eye towards reconfiguring the restaurant so that I only have 3 stations. And I only need 3 people here rather than 4 to make it work. So all of these responses are likely when employers are told to pay workers more than the workers are currently worth. And any one of those, and of course there's one more, which is, depending on what they do, they outsource to suppliers who can pay workers what their labor is worth. So if you're worried about jobs going overseas, which is actually, I hesitate to say that because that's the kind of phrase that has a lot of salience in the current political climate, and no one who says that has any true understanding of what it is they're referring to. So we may want to come back to that. But here's another possibility, is to outsource the work to suppliers who are not constrained, who are not required to pay workers more than their true value. But any one of these 5 responses is actually going to, except for the third one. The 1, 2, 4, and 5, they're actually going to hurt the people we're trying to help. 3 won't necessarily hurt the person we're trying to help, but it will certainly mean their situation is being improved. All right. So for all of these reasons, requiring employers to pay workers more than they are worth is ultimately self-defeating. Now, what's the evidence on these points from the minimum wage debates? It turns out there's been a fair amount of research on minimum wages, and it's very selectively invoked by participants on either side of the political discussion. So, as it turns out, actually, 2 very famous economists have done some research where they claim raising the minimum wage doesn't reduce employment. Now, these are very smart guys, and so you can't just disregard their finding. However, and I have to say, I haven't reminded myself of this literature perhaps to the degree, take that perhaps out. I certainly have not reminded myself of what this literature has to say carefully enough to state this categorically or authoritatively, but my memory of this work is, while they were able to say, in their particular example, raising the minimum wage didn't raise employment, they couldn't explain very well why. That is, they're smarter than me. They know all 5 of those things we had on the last slide. They couldn't tell anyone why those 5 things weren't operating. So, their work, the authors are David Card and Alan Kruger, their work is cited frequently by people who are in favor of minimum wage increases, and I think cited irresponsibly. That work, while provocative, is by no means conclusive. And then, moreover, there's lots of other work on the minimum wage by also very smart people, and I think the reasonable conclusion from the minimum wage literature at this point is that if you raise the minimum wage, yes, you will reduce employment, and the people who are most vulnerable, who are most likely to lose their jobs, are those with the lowest skills. And that means those are the ones who are, in general, most vulnerable, and the ones we want to work hardest to help. Now, what about my other concerns? Will employers search harder for higher skilled workers to replace low skilled workers? And the answer is no one knows. That's never been looked at. Will employers reduce other components of employee costs? No one knows. It's never been looked at. Will employers in the long run invest in technology to perform low skilled jobs? No one knows. It's never been looked at. Will they outsource to suppliers who can pay workers what their labor is worth? No one knows. So there's a lot of uncertainty here into which we are thinking about launching ourselves with legislatively required higher wages. If it were a policy that I wanted to advocate, I would like to be a lot more. I would like to know a lot more about what kind of responses I was going to get before I got really enthusiastic about suggesting that the minimum wage go up to $12. Question?
Well, I just
Hold on one second.
my own.
Go ahead, Bill, and
my own
speak loudly.
Life experience, certainly, I've seen the number 4 invest in technology because I was getting paid $1.40 an hour at a construction site in El Paso, and the minimum wage was raised to $1.60, and the next day they fired 2 laborers and bought a new truck.
Bang.
And so yes, they did invest in technology, and you can see us working on the U.S. side. The water truck had a lever on it, so the guy driving it could make the water come out that went down the roads. Where on the Mexican side, they had 2 guys. One was driving it, the other guy was the one that controlled the valve.
Because the workers were cheaper, right?
Because the
So
workers were
it was
cheaper
cheaper
on
to
the
have a
Mexican
worker than a
side.
lever on the
Right.
Mexican side.
Right,
Yeah.
because we were on the 2 sides of the international borders where the construction was being done.
And you see, that's a great example, and it raises another issue, which is that the minimum wage went up to $1.60, 2 guys got fired and they bought a truck, right? Well, the effects of that then were kind of asymmetric. The 2 guys that got fired, their lives got worse, right? But the guys that remained had this more productive truck to work with, and ultimately, because they were working with better technology, they became more productive, and in the end, their wages probably went up. I mean, they did go up to $1.60, right?
Right.
All right, so in other words, the employer in response made it worth his while to keep you at $1.60 by providing you with better technology, right? So the response to this was asymmetric. The 2 guys who lost their jobs, their lives sucked. The 2 guys who kept their jobs, their lives got better. All right, so we can be happy for that second group of people, but the first group of people, we just made things worse for them. And it's not clear why you were to be privileged by the addition of this technology, and the guy right next to you was to suffer from it by being fired. All that happened because the law changed, right? And so the law, you think of the laws or you like to think of the law as in some sense anonymous. Fair in the sense of not discriminating between people just on who they are, but that law was, in some sense, not at all fair, right? That is, the people who managed to keep their jobs, they did well. The people who couldn't keep their jobs, they got killed, right? The law hurt, and they were otherwise identical, similar. So that's a great example. Yes?
Are you familiar with something called the sandwich?
Eva, okay. And speak loudly, Eva.
Are you familiar with something called the sandwich shop?
I don't know what that word refers to in this context.
It is an Excel file that was put together by a libertarian named David Etkin, and it's an interactive Excel file where you can plug in. It has all the things you need for a sandwich shop, the employees, the amount you pay for the food.
Yeah.
All of the.
So it's the
napkins,
financials.
all of
It's
that.
basically-
it's
it's right.
the financials,
Right.
and you can play with the number of how much the employees make and see where all the other numbers change.
And see how it all balances out. And
Right.
and I guess I don't know what that particular spreadsheet, but that spreadsheet is going to have to include some of these considerations, right? Because you can't just say to somebody, "All right, pay everybody $3 more," and think that's all that's going to happen. That's clearly there's going to be a lot more going on in that, and it's interesting. There's a simulation game in sites that allows you to play with that.
Are you taking questions now?
I am. It sure looks like it. Go ahead.
All right. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. The 2 papers that you referred to, were they by any chance written around 1990, plus or minus time frame?
the Carden-Kruger, the first Carden-Kruger paper, I think, is in 1995, and then there's an ongoing, flow stream of responses and counter-responses.
Please speak up loudly.
The reason I ask that is because about that time, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial about, call it a third paper, which reviewed two papers that purported to find reverse correlation on the effect of the minimum wage. And the third paper debunked the results. One of the papers had cherry-picked their data, and the second paper had methodology problems.
Well, there are intense discussions of those issues in the academic literature. You'll forgive me, I don't think of the Wall Street Journal editors as being authoritative in this matter. But the issues they raise are issues that are being raised on all sides of the academic discussion with regard to how you sort out what the effects of these things actually are.
Well, this was a third academic paper. It wasn't the editorial board making the conclusions. It was conclusions of a third paper.
Well, and that may, but where the state of the science actually is depends on kind of where you look in time. That is, I'm sure that paper existed, and I'm sure that a couple of years later, Carden-Kruger or somebody else published a rebuttal. I know they've been going back and forth. Dave Newmark is typically on the other side, but they've been going back and forth for at least 20 years on this thing.
In response to your point number 4, they invest in technology to perform low-skilled jobs and no one knows. Also about that time, the president of General Motors, whose last name was Smith, this is my last name, that's why I remember this, he was president only for a year or two. It was during a labor strike or labor negotiations, and they were pushing for higher wages, and he let loose the crack that every $1 an hour increase in wages justified 5,000 robots. So it certainly had been issued as a threat.
Well, that's interesting, but I have to say, I don't have a lot of sympathy for GM, particularly at that time. When GM and its workers were fighting over wages at that time, none of that was a market-based transaction. That is, GM was exploiting monopoly power, and they and their employees were fighting over how to split the monopoly rents. That wasn't a particularly edifying experience or spectacle from anybody's point of view. But the challenge is clearly there, right? That is, robots cost something, workers cost something else. If what workers' costs go up, the robots look, and you don't raise the minimum wage for robots at the same time, the robots look more attractive. There's no question about it. And unfortunately, a lot of these low-wage jobs, at least historically, were precisely in the kinds of industries that were most susceptible to mechanization. That is, to the extent that low-wage jobs were concentrated in manufacturing, in tasks that were repetitive. Well, that's exactly where you go when you want to mechanize, right? The first thing you do is you find the jobs that aren't very challenging and that are repetitive. That's what machines do best. And of course, that's what low-skilled workers do best as well. So the low-skilled workers and the technology are going head-to-head right there for the bottom rung on the ladder. And that's not a pretty sight. So, can we bring me back here? There we are. All right, so here's the great danger. Oh, what did I do? There we go. The great danger is that these policies will hurt precisely those whom they are most intended to help. The most vulnerable, the lowest skills. They're most easily mechanized, as we just said, and their tasks are probably most susceptible to redefinition and reassignment. I mean, I don't worry about being replaced by a machine. I don't ever worry about being replaced by a machine. Right? If I was a secretarial, we don't even have it. In fact, I was going to say if I was a secretary, I'd be worried about being replaced by a machine. The fact is, that's already happened. The administrative staff in our department is half of what it was when I first got here, and I remember vividly the last of my colleagues who expected to have a typist, and I remember how difficult this transition was when the department said, we don't do that anymore. Our administrative people don't do that. They're not going to take your handwritten, your manuscript on yellow legal paper and key it in for you. That just doesn't happen. And the poor guy spent a couple of years getting used to that thought. But So the most vulnerable, the lowest skilled, are those who are most vulnerable to the risks associated with mechanically raising the minimum wage. So, practical effects of the living wage. Those whose low, so as we said, going back to like the third slide, those with low living standards who are not at work, raising the minimum wage won't affect them. Those with low wages who are living in households with high standards of living, again, they're going to get subsidized by the minimum wage, but they don't need it. So that money's wasted. Those with low wages in low standard of living households, they may get a temporary income gain. Their incomes may go up temporarily while their employers figure out what to do, but in the long run, they're going to suffer. They're going to suffer. And so these policies have the potential to do great harm. Now, let's talk a little bit about the ethical context. And, I'm sorry, let me go. Let's talk about the ethical context, and let me begin by saying this. People who support the minimum wage, if they're raising the minimum wage, if they're confronted with the analysis that I just presented to you, they have two responses. The only analytical response they have is to say there is research that shows that the employment losses that there are no employment losses. That's their only analytical response. And they're right about that, but of course, they're only half right. That is, there's also research that goes the other way. Plus, there are plenty of potential costs that the research hasn't addressed. Now, the other response that those who support minimum wages will typically come up with is an ethical one. And they'll say, and in fact, there was a letter to the editor of the Denver Post yesterday that said this. That said, people who work full-time should be able to afford an acceptable standard of living. All right. So, again, conflating the two observations that we began with, low wages and low standard of living. So as an ethical or moral position, people who work full-time should be able to afford an acceptable standard of living. Now, that may be something you believe, but then the question is, how do you get there? Can you get there by making the employer pay for that standard of living? And when you ask that, I think people who think they support an increase in the minimum wage, they actually flounder, because if you ask them, for example, suppose someone comes to your door and says, I'm going to mow your lawn. I'll mow your lawn for $20. You say, okay. They come back 10 minutes later, they say, I'm done. You look out and you say, you didn't mow the lawn. And the worker says, well, I did what I could. Pay me $20. Would you say, well, you haven't accomplished the task, and I'm going to have to pay again to have the task done, but I respect the dignity of your labor, and so I'm going to pay you $20 anyhow? And would you further say, not only that, I respect the dignity of your labor so much that you can come back next week and fail to do the task again for $20? Well, if you ask people, is that how you feel about this? Then they sort of dissolve. They don't have a response. And for obvious reasons, right? They don't have a response because even people who passionately support the increase in the minimum wage themselves would not behave as they expect employers to behave when the minimum wage is passed. That is, they themselves, to the extent that they employ anyone, would not continue to do so if they were required consistently to pay more than the worker was worth. All right, so where do we go instead? All right, why do workers have low skills? Well, their skill endowments may be weak. That is, their cognitive abilities may be limited, their physical health may be limited, their families of origin do not provide or support investment in skills. Perhaps they weren't nurtured in a way that allowed their skills to flourish as they could have. Their communities didn't provide the schooling that would support investment in skills. These are all reasons why people might not be as productive enough to be able to sustain themselves in an acceptable standard of living. And lastly, they might have chosen not to invest. Well, the employer wasn't responsible for any of this. That is, when a worker presents to an employer as someone who's not capable of great productivity, the employer doesn't say, gosh, you're not very productive. That's really my fault. The employer doesn't say that, and the employer shouldn't say that. The employer's never seen this person before. So there are good reasons why an employee might not have skills, but they're not the employer's responsibility. Right? And stepping out of the minimum wage discussion, stepping out of the economic discussion, thinking about life in general, making people responsible for issues over which they have no authority is always a prescription for failure. Always. Go ahead.
Thank you. I attended a living wage discussion in the Boulder City environment, which is, I was one of maybe two people in the whole room that thought there was a strange thing that it was okay for the city of Boulder to pay a living wage and insist that all their contractors pay the living wage. And the argument there, when all these other things were brought up, was that it's the city of Boulder, well, it's a government, we have all the money we need because we get it from our taxpayers. And when I brought up, don't you have any responsibility to the taxpayers to be responsible with your, to get the very best price you can for the labor you're paying for, they looked at me like I had just grown a second head. So there's a government, when government gets involved, it's a government paying the living wage. You get a whole nother set of ethical questions. I'd love for you to, I don't know if you've run into that, or, but a lot of it is government payment.
I think I was there.
You may have been the other guy in the room.
Yeah, I know. In fact, this is the talk I'm giving you today. I originally prepared for a presentation. I was part of a panel that discussed this proposal in the city of Boulder. And yes, some of the response was, government. This is government. Government isn't a competitive entity, right? So the government isn't constrained. You know, we can pay $20 for $10 an hour for $10 an hour talent, and it's not as if we're going to go out of business. We don't think. Right? It's not as if we're going to go out of business. And there is some truth to that. Now, what it does mean, of course, is that people who don't want to pay the taxes in support of that will move out of the city. And so there is actually, even within the city government context, there is a competitive mechanism, because there are alternative places to live that are, reasonable substitutes. They're reasonably close by. They have somewhat similar housing and so forth. So, in the long run, that argument doesn't even work there, right? But, it is true. But as I'm going to come back, the fundamental problem here is that people have standards of living that are unacceptably low. And I actually agree with that. The question is, how do you fix it? And the answer is still, part of the answer is going to be government, right? But if you're going to raise taxes, how are you going to spend it? Are you going to spend it on paying your own employees more than they're actually worth, or are you going to spend it some other way? And I'm going to advocate for spending it some other way, because I think it's much more effective.
Scott, do you have a question?
Yeah. I tend to think in terms of philosophy or principles rather than specifics, and I'm a little surprised I'm not hearing the basic principle behind this. It's like you can't really argue about what's the proper minimum wage, because the basic principle behind it, there's very little science in the sense of really understanding and controlling how economics works. But there are some principles, and one of them, like wage and price, like supply and demand and how they're interrelated. The basic principle here is wage and price controls always result in market distortions, shortages, and black markets, all of which you've been describing here. There is no way to control these things from the top down in a non-totalitarian society or socialist society. The decisions have to be made by the employees and the employers, not by someone in government who thinks they know what's best for things. So again, the principle behind this, and it's not possible to say based on that principle how this is going to go. It's just that wage price controls always result in market distortion, shortages, and black markets. Sorry, that wasn't a question.
I think I have a fair amount of sympathy for that position. I think that the theme I've been developing here is that, in general, imposing wage floors by the government is going to be distorting in ways that are destructive, ultimately, even of the immediate goals. But I'm not in complete sympathy with your position, because I think there are very well-defined economic circumstances in which government intervention is actually essential for a well-functioning economy. They are, and to speak generally, the provision of public goods is something that cannot be done efficiently by the private sector, no matter how free or competitive the market is. Externalities.
That's disputed.
Sorry?
That's disputed.
Not by anyone I respect. It'll be interesting to see. Externalities. Externalities. If the markets are incomplete, there are externalities. You generally cannot expect private interactions to resolve them efficiently. And if there's market power, that one of the great things, the fundamental irony or paradox of the competitive market is that the competitive market has enormously positive properties, but the reason competition works is precisely because no one wants to be competitive. No one wants to be competitive. Everyone would prefer to be in a situation where they weren't subject to competition. And you've all had that experience, right? So what competition works precisely because everyone is trying so hard to insulate themselves from competition. They're trying to improve their product or improve their productivity so they don't have to worry about someone else stealing their lunch. Well, when everyone out there is trying, individually, is trying to subvert competition, is trying to create a situation for themselves where they don't have to worry about that, every so often, someone's going to succeed. The auto manufacturers in the 1950s were a clear example of that. Google and Facebook may be another example of that. When they, and of course the oil companies in the early 20th century were an example of that. When someone actually succeeds, they compete so successfully that they no longer are subject to competition. Well, then the competitive markets fall apart completely. And without government intervention, without collective intervention, not only will the markets fail, but they will not be able to reestablish themselves. So I'm not going to go as far as to say the government should never intervene. On the contrary, I think there are very well-defined circumstances where government intervention is essential. But the minimum wage is not one of them. So, living wage policies basically tell employers the following. We're worried about these workers because they aren't very productive. That's true. It isn't your fault. That's also true. We're going to make you fix it. In other words, we're going to put your money where our mouth is. We care about this and we're going to make you pay for fixing it. Well, ethically, that's a little bit tricky, right? Responsibility misalignment. In personal life, we may occasionally take responsibility for problems we didn't create, and sometimes that's admirable, sometimes that's unfortunate, sometimes it's a product of our circumstances and we're not very comfortable with it, right? But in general, assigning responsibility for solutions to those who did not create the problem is not going to work. And this is an example. It creates very problematic incentives. I guess that's what I'm saying. If I know that I make the mess, you're going to clean it up. And most of you have probably been parents, right? And you absolutely know the first rule of parenting is, or maybe the second rule, there's got to be consequences. There's got to be consequences. If your children know you're always going to clean up after them, they are never going to clean up for themselves, right? That's an exactly analogous incentive problem to the one that's created when we say we as a society have failed these. I mean, some of these people can't work because their disabilities or their skills are so limited. There's nothing we can do for them. But a lot of the reason why they're not so productive is that we as a society have not given them the context in which their skills could be developed. So if we as a society want to take responsibility for this, that's fine. There's good reason for that. But when we as a society take responsibility, that's not the same as saying you employers have to fix it on behalf of all of us. So, as I said, putting other people's money where your mouth is a very thin virtue, if it's a virtue at all. All right. So, if you're going to advocate for the living wage, if you're going to advocate for it responsibly, what should you be able to verify? You should be able to verify that the benefits of the policy actually accrue to those who are intended. You got to verify that not many of the benefits are not wasted on those who don't need it, and that somehow you're going to help those who need the help but aren't getting it through this policy. They got to be able to explain, as I said, why are wages low and what will prevent employment losses, and they can't. Basically, they can't. So, if you wanted to deal with this responsibly, what would you do? The concern is societal, right? Failures to encourage skill accumulation are also partially societal. They have to do with schooling and a variety of other social contexts. And if you want to take responsibility for them, that's fine. Society should pay. Okay, raise taxes, and address the consumption issue directly. Instead, the motivating problem here is that these people have living standards that are too low. Address that directly instead of addressing it indirectly by trying to force their wages up so they can afford something better. Address their consumption situation directly by dispersing benefits. So for those who work, things like the Earned Income Tax Credit are very effective. And moreover, they deliver most of the poorest, and the incentive distortions from the Earned Income Tax are minimal. That is, for most, certainly they create great incentives to work. They may reduce the incentive somewhat to work more effectively, but that's a cost that I think you could afford to accept. For those who have low living standards and who don't work, the solution is direct assistance, one way or another. Now, it's understood that direct assistance has lots of incentive problems. You're going to have to deal with that, but you're going to have to find some uncomfortable compromise, perhaps, between those, across those various incentive problems. But if you want people who don't work to have more to consume, the only way you can do that is give it to them. And you have to accept there are going to be challenges in doing that effectively. All right? And at least when you have those problems are restricted to the relationship between you, society, and the beneficiaries. You haven't invoked the employers as a third party and asked them to accommodate the distortions as well. So, thank you for your attention. Again, to summarize, I think the fundamental motivation here is that people don't live well enough, and if that's your concern, do directly address the way in which they live. Don't make the employer somehow take responsibility for a problem that they not only didn't create, but can't effectively solve. Thank you.
Okay, for those who are new here, we have, please raise your hand. I will take the names in the order. So we have Heidi, then Brian, then, hold on a second, Heidi, Brian, Steve, and Lee. Steve and Lee. Anybody else want? Chris and Lee. Sorry.
And me.
And Eva. Anybody else who wants to get on the list? I'm surprised that my Eva is not yelling her head off. Okay. She stepped out. So Heidi first, and when you're talking, because the way the things are set up on the system, if the amount of noise, voice going into the mic is too low, it gets nothing. So, but if I lower the gate, then we get background noise, so I think you understand. Please speak loudly into the mic, hold it close to your mouth, please.
Okay, I'm not an economist, but I was thinking of writing an opinion piece on this subject for the Daily Camera, and I was going to entitle it, Don't Be Cruel, because I think it's pretty cruel to take opportunity away from people, especially the people that need it the most.
Heidi, please, much closer to your mouth. Thank you.
I agreed with just everything you said, except one little thing. You said that people who have low living standards and aren't at work, there's no effect on them. Well, there is an effect that if labor rates go way up, then the cost of goods and services are going to go way up. So there's going to be that bad effect. I mean, they're not at work, they already have low living standards, and it's going to be even harder for them. And everything costs more, right?
That's a good point, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
How big that effect is open to discussion, certainly, but you're right. That's a secondary effect that I didn't include and that would certainly be worth thinking about.
Okay, I have some points here that I would include if I was writing a piece about this. Scott mentioned basic principles. Well, a basic principle of libertarianism is freedom of contract and freedom of association, and that's violated by this. I mean, I say to people, suppose somebody's willing to work for $10 an hour and somebody's willing to pay them for $10 an hour. How can the government intervene and say, no, we won't allow that? It just violates a very basic right. And even if there's a law against it, people are going to do it anyway. They're going to work under the table for the cash. So you've made a criminal tax evader out of a person who's just desperate for some income. So you're criminalizing work below a certain wage.
And it's funny, I have my thoughts are parallel but not similar. You know, you refer to it as a question of rights. I think of it. I come to the same conclusion, but I think of it as a question of efficiency. It's economically inefficient. You're wasting resources if you prevent that kind of contract from being struck.
Well, there are all sorts of arguments you can make here. You know, economic, there are moral arguments, constitutional arguments, there are historic arguments. You can say this is racist in its origins. The first minimum wages was racist. It was like, you know, against blacks, right? There are lots of arguments. But anyway, I mean, you only have so much space in an opinion piece, so you have to choose which approach. And you take the more economic approach, I think. Anyway, another point, this whole argument seems to be based on the idea that money is the only thing people work for. And obviously, the fact that so many people work unpaid internships proves there are lots of other things you get out of work, like connections and experience and, you know, the opportunity to prove yourself and good work habits and all the rest. And I know elderly people that don't need the money, but they work just to stay mentally and socially active. So all those people, you know, might be deprived of it. Do you know what I mean? Another point, I think it exploits people's economic illiteracy by giving them the illusion that if they earn this, they're going to be bumped up to this, and they're not told of the possibility that if they earn this, they might be bumped down to zero, which is the real minimum wage, when they lose their job, when they get outsourced or automated or, you know what I mean? Like, the restaurant hostess can easily be replaced with a sign that says, please seat yourself. And she'll go for this thinking, oh, I'll get 15. No, she's going to get 0. She's going to get a pink slip and be replaced by a sign. Another point, you know, jobs are going to be automated all the faster with a higher labor costs. But even if this legislation doesn't pass, just the threat of higher labor costs, which is happening now everywhere, just the threat of it is enough. People right now, in the fast food business in particular, they're making decisions right now to hurry up and automate because they think they're going to have to pay much higher labor costs. And if they have to pay much higher labor costs in, you know, the state of Washington or the city of Portland, that automation is going to come everywhere. Another thing most people don't think about is if the low-wage people get bumped up to 12 or 15, what about the people currently earning 15? They're going to be expected to be bumped up. There's kind of a ripple effect, isn't there, all the way up the wage scale?
That got Walmart into trouble when they did that.
When you're going to interject, I need it much louder. Heidi, could we...
Okay, one more point.
Okay.
Ethics. I mean, I would turn that around on someone and say, what's ethical about putting a gun in somebody's ribs and initiating force like this? You know, the employee would never do it himself, would never put the gun in the ribs of the employer. He's just using government agents by proxy to get what he wants. Right? He's using the force of government to do it for him because he wouldn't do it.
Okay.
I have an objection to that last point.
We'll get to...
And the internship point.
Okay. And I forgot... Mark? No. I forgot your name again. I'm sorry.
No, you're forgetting his name.
Chris. Anyway, we have... Brian is next, please. And please get that microphone close to your mouth, otherwise... Yes.
So my sense is now we're having a discussion, right? Are you expecting me to respond to each? Or?
You are the guest. You get to talk anytime you want to.
Okay.
So do you wish to respond to any of Heidi's points?
I thought they were all very interesting. The ripple effect. The economic literacy one is an interesting one because I'll ask my students, when the minimum wage gets raised from $7 to $10, what happens to people who are currently getting paid $7? And they unanimously will say, well, they get paid $10. And so you actually have to walk them through, if they're really worth $10, why aren't they getting paid that right now? And similarly, the ripple effect that you talk about, if I'm at $12 an hour and I see the $7 an hour, people getting up to $10 an hour, I'm going to think that I'm going to get another $3, but the truth is what I do hasn't changed. And the value of what I produce hasn't changed, and the ability of the employer to pay me hasn't changed. And so, no, I'm actually not going to go up to $15 an hour. So it's very likely that people who are voting for this are voting for this with expectations that are going to be disappointed.
Brian.
So, libertarians tend to feel that private ways to help the poor are more efficient than government ways. But if we make the assumption that, for the sake of argument, that we go along with liberals and say that government is going to help the poor, as you're saying, as society's concerned, then I've often agreed with the point you made that there's a responsibility misalignment, because essentially what this is it's a tax on those that employ low-skilled people. They're the ones that are paying for it. It's instead of going to the government and then back to low-skilled people, it's just going directly from the employer to the low-skilled people, but essentially it's like a tax. And the ones that are paying for it are the ones that are already helping out the low-skilled people. So it seems as though liberals should understand that investment banks and law firms and people like that that employ high-skilled people are opting out of the tax. Essentially, this is something that benefits the wealthy and is harming the ones that are helping the low-skilled people. And
I agree.
the same with big business. That big businesses tend to be able to pay higher wages. They tend to be hurt less. So, like with many regulations, if they feel they're hurt less than their smaller competitors, then they back this. So it seems as though essentially this is something that's that liberals should see as not in sync with what they claim to value, and that if society is going to help the poor, or rather government is going to help the poor, that it should be done through the regular tax structure. Libertarians might disagree whether to do that at all, but if it's going to be done, then it's lesser evil to do it that way than it is to tax. Well, it's like that Boulder has a sin tax being proposed for the soda tax. Liberals understand that you tax something, you get less of it in that realm, but then they don't understand that taxing people that pay minimum wage will get less minimum wage people employed.
I absolutely agree with you. That incongruity that high-skilled workers and employers of high-skilled workers escape this responsibility. That's a further incongruity that ought to make people uncomfortable. I don't want to stop though at the characterization of liberals as being economically less literate than you would like, because the people on the right end of the conventional political spectrum believe all sorts of crap about how the economy works that no thoughtful person could possibly sustain. So economic illiteracy is not a disease specifically of the left.
We have Chris next. And Chris, please, get that microphone right up to your mouth.
So, forgive me, I'm a little handicapped. I don't have a notebook, so I'm going to kind of shoot from the hip here.
Louder, Chris. Sorry.
Louder?
Yeah.
I'm closer than anybody else can bend the microphone.
It's not recording you.
Oh, gosh.
Is it on? Looks like the light's off.
It's off.
The mic was off. That was
That it's okay.
Might be dead.
Just press it for 2 or 3 seconds.
Better?
Yes.
All right. So, while Heidi brought up the potentially the low-skilled and not working people receiving negative effects of living wage, I also want to, as probably the closest to my teenage years of all of us here, bring up the fact that there's definitely the potential for the people who don't need or don't have a low standard of living but are making the minimum wage. They have the potential of losing their jobs as well, and I think, or not being able to get them in the first place due to a minimum wage. So I just wanted to bring that up while we were talking about additional effects. Oh gosh, see, now's when I forget what I was going to say.
I'll put you back on the list, Chris, after...
I can remember it. I really should have taken out my notebook. Well, I'll try and remember them. I'll pass it on.
Okay, Lee is next.
To continue on Heidi's points about the effect on the non-working people, in that group are people who are not seeking work, but then there are people who are seeking work, and it creates a higher hurdle that they have to jump in order to find employment. So there is an effect in people trying to get in. Another point I had speaks to Brian's very insightful point about Brian's insightful point about that it's essentially a tax on business, but it's a direct tax. Well, an interesting thing about taxes is, if you've ever been in business, is that it's just another cost of doing business. The little phrase we've all heard, And there is another little phrase that answers the question, what must happen to every cost of doing business, which is?
It's passed on.
It is passed on. Thank you. So why, is there maybe, let's say, an economic approach that would say, well, this is just another cost of doing business that affects all of my competitors the same as it affects me. I'm just going to jack my prices, cut the wages of my higher paid employees, or lower the returns to my investors because everyone else is doing the same thing. Is this possibly a point for why the sensitivity on business is maybe not as high, or that you've not seen come out in the data quite so much as we might think just on the basis of principle?
So there are a lot of subtleties embedded in that question. You're right that when a business's job is to balance its costs with its revenues, right? And if some cost element goes up, at least nominally, you might think, can I adjust for that by somehow reducing other costs, or can I adjust for it by increasing other revenues? And so, yes, you could imagine a world where employers just said, my labor costs went up by 5%, all my prices go up by 5% as well, doesn't affect me in the least. Now, that's unlikely. That's less likely. And the reason people think that is the following. When you decide to change the price of anything, your immediate question is, how responsive will demand for that be? If I jack the price up, how many fewer am I going to sell? So as an employer, you're balancing two things. If I reduce what I pay my workers, or if I increase what I pay my workers, what's going to happen to the workers that will work for, how many workers I can employ? And if I raise the price for what I produce, what's going to happen to how much that I can sell? Right? Now, fundamentally, we believe that the sensitivities are greater on the product side. That is, if this restaurant raises its price by $1 per dish, it's going to notice a reduction in demand, right? Fewer customers are going to come. The labor market is a little bit less, we think of as typically being a little less sensitive. And this could be spoken of with a lot of sophistication, but to try to make it simple as possible, basically people have to work, right? So, people who are making $8 an hour, if you pay them $9 an hour, they're going to be happy. If you pay them $7 an hour, they're going to be unhappy. But they're not going to, either at $7, $8, or $9 an hour, they're going to be working full time because they need to be working full time in order to support themselves. So basically, the sensitivity of labor to what they get paid is relatively small. The sensitivity of restaurant customers to what they get charged is higher, and that's why we typically expect most of the responses are going to be in the labor market rather than the output market. But I agree that's a assertion based on what you might think of as more general principles. It's not something that has been actually hunted down in the literature.
Quick follow-up.
Close.
I have a quick follow-up. Then, in the case of the restaurant, particularly this restaurant, no one really has to come here to eat. So if the prices go up by $1 a dish, it loses customers. Those customers simply buy more food at King Soopers.
Yeah.
To someone. So, as a concept, if that applies across the board to every progressively higher discretionary business or service that's offered, then it would seem to me that a consequence would be that it would, in effect, lower the standard of living. It would lower the highest neat stuff that you could buy. Fewer people can afford it. So on average, doesn't it mean a coarsening of the economy as a consequence?
In principle, those effects could exist. My instinct is that they're of second order importance. That they're going to be small enough that they'd be hard to identify, and they'd be hard to identify. The immediate issues, the primary issues are still, are you actually going to help the people you're intending to help? And the first order analysis is, it looks very unlikely.
Okay. It's Eva, Ralph. Chris, did you remember your questions?
Yeah, but you wanted to go before me.
Identify your name, please.
Conrad.
Oh, Conrad, I'm so sorry. I do want to talk to you, Conrad, after this. Eva, just 1 second. So it's Eva, Ralph, Conrad, Brian, Anybody else want to talk? Steve? Anybody else?
One more question.
Jerry? And then Heidi. Did you need to jump in, Heidi?
Later.
Later it is. So, Eva, you're next. Please speak up loudly.
Yeah, as someone who spent a lot of time with a friend who had a husband with a brain deficit caused by a medical accident, I strongly object in some sense to the characterization that the best way to get people at the bottom levels who need the skills and who also have bad situations is through the government. After going through pass after pass after pass trying to get assistance for her from the government, we found a nonprofit who would have helped her in a heartbeat. And why the nonprofit organizations are not considered a primary source for helping people out at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak, you kind of left that out completely.
I certainly don't object if they want to. On the contrary, I think that's admirable. I don't see in the United States today anything like the scale of philanthropic response that would be necessary to equally help all the people that we think of as being in need.
Of course, you've already paid the government to do that.
I'm sorry?
You've already paid the government to do that.
Yeah, I agree. There's some substitution there. And it's possible if the government withdrew, private philanthropy would to some degree replace it. Again, my intuition is that's not a one-for-one proposition. That is, particularly, I got to say, this is the Mountain States. My understanding is the Mountain States sort of. I better not say that. There are variations in the intensity of philanthropic activity across the country, and my impression is that where we live, the philanthropic instinct is not as aggressive, is not as vital as it is in many other places. So, in Colorado in particular, I'd be reluctant to rely entirely on the private sector, even if the public sector were to withdraw entirely from this field.
And we need to improve the competence of the government sector.
Oh, I'll never object to that. But remember, as a government employee, it's easy to take cheap shots at the government. Is the government really effective? And the answer is no. On the other hand, I know lots of government employees who I think of as being really dedicated to their work. Part of the reason government has such a bad reputation for being ineffective is precisely because it's public, and you see it. But any of you who work in the private sector, tell me if I'm wrong. You come home 2 days out of 5 in each week, and the first thing you say is, you won't believe the incredibly stupid thing my boss did. Or you won't believe the incredibly stupid thing my colleague did. And the reason why the private sector doesn't get beat up for inefficiency in the same way that the public sector gets beat up is precisely because it's private. They don't have to make that stuff public. Right, so this is what's the law? This was Gene Roddenberry. Who's Gene Roddenberry? Anybody remember?
Sure.
Right, exactly. So he was once interviewed by a science fiction critic who said who challenged him with the assertion, "Isn't it true that 90% of science fiction is junk?" And his response was, "90% of everything is junk," which is, I think, strikingly insightful. And it's not, Gene Roddenberry didn't initiate that, so I'm not attributing it to the original source. But, is government inefficient? Absolutely. Do they waste a lot of money? Absolutely. I was just reading today about the VA hospital. Good Lord, what a mess. At the same time, I don't think the government is unique in that. That's sort of people, and the private sector has got its own mishigas. It just isn't required to reveal it in the same way that the government is.
Both sides are stuck with the requirements of paperwork, that most of which came from the government.
Oh yeah, but
and the bureaucracy is what makes it incompetent.
Yes and no. I think is there excessive paperwork, and I'm sure there is. At the same time, a lot of that paperwork happened because somebody, like the Gold King mine. Somebody dumped a bunch of poison in a river, and we said, oh, something's got to be done about that. And now all of a sudden, you got to keep track of where your effluent goes and so forth. So most of that had an initial provocation that a lot of us would probably think of as being reasonable. Now, the way it all comes together and whether or not it's been optimized in any reasonable way? That's a reasonable question. But again, that's not a governmental problem at all. That's not a uniquely governmental problem. If you go into any big business and ask them, how many different computer systems do you have? How many different human resource systems do you have? The answer is way more than we should, right? So, I'm not willing to let I'm not excusing the government, but I'm not willing to let government take the whole blame for this. A lot of what you don't like about government is what you don't like about life, right? And so, and economic activity throughout.
Okay, it's Ralph, which is me, then Conrad, Brian, Steve, Jerry, Heidi. Anybody else? And Lee. Anybody else? I don't need that because that mic is picking me up.
Not anymore. Sorry.
Actually, that lighted button will mute me. Very good. In terms of your cough, I want you to know that Chelsea Clinton's dorm room is across the street. Okay. You had a slide up about people not being in the labor force. And one of the things I did not hear you say, now, I as a libertarian, I like the freedom to contract, and I agree in 99% of the things that you had said. But is it possible that with a minimum wage that is too low, people do not enter the labor force because they do not think that they're going to be getting enough even to live on, and therefore their costs of going to work exceed the benefit of working?
It's possible that people think that, but they'd be wrong.
Okay, next person.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, among those who are not working are those whose expectation is that what pay they might get would be so little that it wouldn't be worth their while. Right? There's certainly people like that. Now, if you raise the minimum wage, they might think to themselves, "Oh, now I'll get paid more." But you're going right back to my fifth slide. Why was it that without the minimum wage, they couldn't get that kind of wage? And the answer is they don't have the skills. So when there's a minimum wage that looks attractive to them, they can present themselves to an employer and they could say, "Look, I used to think I was only going to get $5 an hour because I'm really only a $5 an hour person. That's my skill level. But now the minimum wage is $7, so I'd be delighted to work for you $7 an hour." They can, they can and they will do that. But the employer's going to say, "Look, you were a $5 an hour skill before the minimum wage went up. You're still a $5 an hour skill, and before the minimum wage went up, I might have been willing to pay you $5 an hour. But now the minimum wage is $7. You're still a $5 an hour worker. I'm not going to pay you $7 an hour to get your $5 an hour worth of value. And so you may have thought this minimum wage was going to open up opportunities for you, but it didn't. The absence of opportunity for you is not because the minimum wage was low. It's because your skills are such that there's a limit to what anyone can afford to pay you. And that limit is sufficiently low that it's not worth your while to go to work." So no. So you're right. Many people will take the raise, an increase in the minimum wage as an opportunity, as you described, but they'll be misleading themselves, and they'll quickly be disabused. They'll show up at the employer's door, and the employer will say, "I might have wanted you at 5. I don't want you at 7. Good luck. Have a nice life."
The next person is Conrad. Please pass the microphone to him, and please speak loudly.
Is this loud enough?
Let me look at the meter. Yes, it is.
Okay. So I have two objections to something you said. Starting with the first thing you said was internships and unpaid work. Yes, there are people who go to work for things besides money. Maybe their work is gratifying. Maybe they want to stay socially and professionally sharp in their later years. But I'm going to say a vast majority of all Americans do not go to work for those reasons. They go to work to get paid because they need to get paid because they have rent, they have bills, they have medical expenses, they have prior convictions that don't solely revolve around them. And if you ask any student at CU, I'm willing to say 99.99 recurring 9%. If you say, "Would you like an unpaid or paid internship?" they're going to say paid internship. And on top of that, from what you get out of an
False
internship,
dichotomy. it's unpaid, it might be unpaid internship or nothing. The alternative might be nothing.
The internship doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't. In fact, I interned for the Democratic Party, and that was a huge. I'm trying to keep it clean. It was a huge mistake. And I know a lot of people who interned for a lot of other companies, including banks that did pay, and they said it was a huge mistake. And you don't gain anything from an internship. It's all a bunch of hoopla to get bootlicking work. It is total. It is a total crapshoot. Secondly, there was another point that you made that was about the essential this desire to work, and you can choose. It's essentially like a choice, I think, is what you're getting after. If I didn't have to work, I would be more than happy to disappear into the mountains. But since we live in a fiat currency society, I need money to buy bullets, buy tags, buy game licenses, buy fishing license, fuel, all sorts of things in order to survive. I mean, I would have a very difficult time. Temps as well. I would have a very difficult time surviving whittling sticks and spearfishing in the winter of Colorado with no other supplies.
Well, you can do it.
No, I don't think I can do it. Actually, I am not nearly hardened enough to do it. And what I'm really getting here with this question is, what is your opinion on the merits of the argument that not everyone works for money? I think that's kind of a dystopian ideal more than anything else.
Whatever you may think of the University of Colorado, every person on that faculty there could be making twice and 3 times what they're currently making if they had chosen a different occupation. So money is not everything. In fact, people in my department could easily triple their incomes if they were willing to go somewhere else. When you work, you embrace a constellation of experiences. One of them is the paycheck. The others are the nature of the work itself, the tasks, the interactions, and so forth. And people make trade-offs among them all the time. And people take lower-paying jobs in return for more favorable circumstances all the time. So no, money is not the only thing that matters. Now, at the low end of the labor market, those trade-offs may be less common. That is, if my choice is to be a professor or to be a consultant, you can see how each of them has their attractions. If, on the other hand, you're working as on the line at a fast food restaurant, could you give up $1 for an hour for a nicer environment? And the answer is, that's a hard trade-off, right? So those trade-offs are not as present in the population that we're talking about. But don't kid yourself. Everyone is alert to the other characteristics of their job besides the magnitude of the paycheck, and everyone will turn down a noxious job at a very high wage for a job that pays less, but is more comfortable. So I disagree with you in general, although I agree that the point you're making is more salient at the lowest income levels. The lowest income levels, mere survival is sufficiently important that you will endure ugly circumstances, uncomfortable circumstances in order to get a paycheck.
Which is the whole argument about the Fight for 15 campaign, that wage floor, essentially. Which is what this whole argument about raising the minimum wage gravitates around, is those who work for subsistence and that are trying to make more money in an environment that they aren't comfortable with. So for example, I don't think a college professor or someone who has tenure at a university is in any league that's comparable to someone who's flipping burgers on the line, or someone who's getting paid minimum wage. Because, like you said, you have options to make trade-off companies. So how comfortable you are with your work versus how much you're getting paid, and like you said, that's not something people get who are primarily advocating for this pay raise or wage raise.
I think that's probably true, but again, we come back to the basic conclusion of my presentation, which is that do people who make $7 an hour have lives that are challenging and that we wish were better? And the answer is probably. I certainly do feel that way. All right, so if we want to make them better, how do we do it? Do we force their employer to pay them more? And I think no, because that's not actually going to work. If you want to make their lives better, make their lives better. Give them stuff. Give them stuff and deal with the incentive problems associated with that. But don't pretend to give them stuff by forcing the employer to pay them more than they're worth in the hopes that nevertheless the employer will do that, and then they'll be able to buy stuff that they couldn't otherwise have. You can't solve a consumption problem through the production side. That's fundamentally the issue. And that's the fundamental misunderstanding that advocates of minimum wage and $15 minimum wage and living wage, whatever you want to call it, the fundamental misunderstanding they have is that there are substantial challenges to fixing a consumption problem with a production-based policy.
Our next questioner is Brian. Please pass the...
So, a couple things. First, had you considered writing an opinion piece for the Camera or the Post about this, especially given there was an article and Ralph passed on about a DU study that was pretty bogus about claiming the minimum wage increase would have this big boost to the economy. I think they essentially took a number that of the extra wages that would be paid and just assumed the economy would be boosted by that, ignoring the unseen of where that money came from.
This is going to sound awful, but it's the truth. I read the article. I appreciate getting it. I noticed the article, and I read the author was a professor of social work or something like that, and I immediately knew that it was crap, and I didn't look at it. So, if you want to know what's in the heart of an economist, I just revealed it to you. Exactly. So, have I thought about writing? And the answer is, sort of. It nibbles around the fringes of my mind. Whether or not I actually will do that. It's an open question. It happens sometimes, and it hasn't. And I do think fundamentally, it would be very positive if we in the academy were more involved in these in public policy issues. And I wish the university was configured in such a way that there was an explicit recognition of that. It's not, and as a consequence, we don't naturally gravitate in this way. We don't gravitate towards engaging the public in the way that we could. I'm sorry about that. And it is possible that I will be motivated, perhaps by this interaction here, to offer my thoughts on it.
Brian, just one second. Professor Hacks, when do you need to leave?
What time is it?
It is now 2 o'clock.
Oh, that would be a good time.
Can you stay a few more minutes for...
A couple more minutes, yeah.
So, you know what, Brian? There is a whole list of people. I apologize. So, please do this quickly. We have Steve, Jerry, Heidi, Lee, and finally me again. And Steve, please speak up.
Okay. There's a few things that I wanted to maybe play a little devil's advocate to. I'll just kind of go through them, and then you can respond to them. First of all, the idea that if prices go up, then the customers will leave. Mm-hmm. Often that kind of has a reverse effect. People inflate a price, and then people come to it because they think it's worth more. I've heard direct stories of a friend who worked in a pool shop and was trying to sell something, like some sort of useless pool thing that nobody was buying, and they cut the price down and down and down, and then finally they just bumped it way up, sold them out right away. And this happens a lot. I hear stories like this, that customers don't...
Let me respond to that, okay? Let me respond to that. It does happen. I think there's a famous Harvard Business School case about Solishnaya vodka where that happens. One of my college roommates was in a family that owned a lumber yard. They took the grandfather, the patriarch, who was a very smart man, took the plywood boards that had a lot of knots in them, and instead of discarding them as garbage, he relabeled them rustic and doubled the price. All right? It does happen, and part of the reason why these stories stick with you and why they're so appealing is because they're so uncommon. So yes, it happens, and in fact, there's a Nobel Prize. George Akerlof's Nobel Prize is in part awarded on his analysis of how this happens. It's not common. If it was common, things would be a lot wackier than they are. As wacky as you think stuff actually is, they would really be nuts if that was common. Right? So no, it happens, but when it's not, these are isolated and entertaining examples.
Steve, 1 second. Professor Hacks, how many more
Zax.
minutes? Zax.
Zax.
How many more minutes do you have?
Oh, let's go till 2:15. Can we do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Steve, let's just get through this quickly so that...
I just checked the appointment. I thought I might have at 2 o'clock. Didn't happen, so I'm not missing that. But
let's applaud the person who...
Yeah, exactly.
Steve, quickly, please.
Yes. So there's also the thing you brought up about, or somebody brought up about the workers who are unemployed who would work if they felt like it was worth their time, if they have other things that they're not going to work below this amount. And everything you're saying I agree with, but I also see tons of places that have now hiring signs. It seems like everywhere I look, they wish they had more employees.
Yeah.
And so it means that they have more money in their budget to pay employees, and they just can't fill the slots to give them money. And if they raise those people's wages, they would have less slots. They might take down the sign, we can't afford any more people. But, like, they might also be able to afford one more person instead of 3, or whatever it is. Like, there's so many places hiring.
Yeah, which is a good thing. But raising the minimum wage isn't going to change that. Right? That is, people who are saying they're hiring, what they're saying is we don't need a higher minimum wage. We're willing to pay more as it is. Right? So, that yes, I agree that's a feature of the labor market. The apparent difficulty that some employers have in filling positions has to do with mismatches between the skills they want and the skills that are available. And ultimately, as much as they want to hire, they're not offering a high enough wage. If you've got an unfilled position, you're not paying enough. Just keep raising the wage, and you'll do that regardless of what happens to the minimum wage.
Right. So that's a really good point. One final thing is that employers that abuse their people are not necessarily making them sleep in a container. Sometimes it's also an abuse that's like a greed-based abuse where they treat them nice, but they lower their wages specifically to line their pockets and then expect government benefits to cover it, like take care of it, like the classic Walmart example.
Right, that example is wrong. So first, do you as an employer want to drive your employees' wages down to the lowest they'll tolerate? And the answer is absolutely yes. What limits that? And the answer is, if you're making if somebody's worth $10 an hour, you're paying them $5, you're making them $5 an hour. Eventually, somebody else is going to look at that same worker and say, you know what? I got a deal for you. I'll give you $6. I'm still exploiting you, and that's good for me. But I'm exploiting you less than your current employer.
Add in the monopoly problem you also have.
Well, that's where
do that first.
That's where the exploitation occurs, right? As I said, when you have distortions on that, well, it's not monopoly, it's monopsony. So if you have, for example, the prototypical small town where the only employer is Walmart, there's only one employer, and there's no alternative for the workers, yeah, you're going to get distortions and you're going to get exploitations, and you should be dealing with that. But the minimum wage is not the way you fix that. The way you fix that is by going directly at the market power. So, do the right thing here. With regard to the Walmart example is wrong. And the reason the Walmart example is wrong is because people believe, and this is an entirely different presentation, so we're not going to get into it in any depth, but people who have employer-sponsored health care, such as myself, such as many of you, most people in that circumstance make the mistake of believing that their employer is paying. And so when you look at Walmart, where they don't sponsor health care, you say, oh, Walmart's not paying, it must be getting a benefit. That's wrong. Your employer does not pay for health care. Understand that clearly, and if you want me to talk about that, just bring me back. Your employer does not pay for health care. And if you want a simple test for that is ask yourself, is it a present? If you think your employer likes you enough to give you an $8,000 present each year, then it's a present, right? If you don't think your employer likes it enough to give you a present, then it's not a present. If it's not a present, then your employer is not paying for it. Who is paying for it? And the answer is you, right? It's coming out of your wages. And there are good reasons why it's coming out of your wages, but it's way too complicated for most people to understand, so they adopt the shorthand, which is, my employer gives me this great present. Your employer's not giving you the great present. And so you're paying for it whether or not your employer sponsors it. And so when Walmart doesn't sponsor it, it doesn't mean that they're somehow not paying their employees. They're paying the employees, just the employees are getting everything in wages instead of getting some of it in wages and others of it in benefits in kind. Okay? So that actually is I'm glad you raised it, even though it's not really appropriate here. that is a very destructive example. That is, people's repetition of that example, clearly not understanding the underlying economics, is generating a whole lot of misunderstanding and a whole lot of very bad policy propositions.
Jerry's next. We only have 9 minutes left. Jerry, put that mic right next to your mouth, and then speak.
And I'll do the same.
No!
Jerry.
No!
Three items haven't come up yet. First, I wonder if apprenticeship would be a valuable word to use for wages below current wages.
No.
And applied all the way up and down the ladder.
No. The reason so this internship discussion is an interesting one. I've got lots of views on it because of my role at the university supervising undergraduate. The problem with, and there are, in fact, you can't have unpaid internships in the private sector. There are federal laws against that, and they're actually there to prevent exploitation. So I think legislating what we just talked about is how legislating a floor on wages is a bad thing. Legislating a ceiling on wages is a bad thing as well. So I'm sorry, maybe you provoked me in ways that were inappropriate. Maybe I didn't understand your question.
Jerry, could we have you come back, Professor Zax, and discuss this, because I want to get through all the other people.
Yeah, okay. That'd be fine.
Great. Yeah. Sorry, Jerry. I apologize. Heidi's next. It's Heidi, Lee, Brian, and then myself.
Jerry had two more.
Go ahead, quickly. And right next to your mouth, Jerry.
We libertarians would like you to think of the legal portion of governance as being equally private as well as public. And that might solve most of the differences between us and you in terms of government. Finally, I would suggest that it's all these imperfect private firms that you've described, private relationships with laborers, are constantly challenged by competition, unlike the same thing in government.
Two responses to that. First, I agree. I'm going to reserve that constantly thing because there are circumstances in which businesses have market power and competition is not as effective as we'd like it to be. And secondly, government actually is subject to competition in the sense that you have choices of which jurisdiction you live in. And if you don't like living in Boulder with its goofy left-wing laws, you can move to Louisville or some other place. And so, again, how effective that competitive mechanism is an open question. But you can't deny that it exists and that people do respond.
Heidi, microphone right next to your mouth, please.
Just a comment, not really a question. The economist Don Boudreaux is really good on this subject, you probably know, and he likes to get people to think of the mandatory minimum as a hurdle that you have to surmount. If it's now at around 8, your services have to be valued at that in the marketplace, or you'll never get your first job. And if the minimum wage is raised, it's just raising the hurdle. You've got to be worth, your skills have to be worth 12 or 15 or something higher. And that's, I think in arguing this point, we just need to hammer away at this to people that it's pretty cruel to raise the hurdle on the people that most need help, the youngest, least skilled, least experienced, least educated people. They can't even some people can't even surmount the hurdle where it is now. And a lot more people can't surmount it when it's raised. So they're doomed. They'll never get a second job until they get a first job, and they won't get a first job until they surmount the hurdle.
I agree. I think, but in fairness to people who support this, I think part of the motivation is that in a society as developed as ours, a wage that low shouldn't be a hurdle. And to some degree, for example, the unemployment rate among college graduates is like 3%. No one with a college degree has to worry about the minimum. Almost no one with a minimum college degree has to worry about the minimum wage. And most people with high school degrees don't have to worry about the minimum wage. We're talking about a relatively small part of the labor force here. And I think part of the motivation is the idea that we shouldn't have people whose skills are that low. Now, I agree, going from in a well-designed society, we shouldn't have people whose skills are that low to, all right, we shouldn't allow anybody to pay that little. That going from there to there, for advocates of these policies, seems like a really small step. When you think about it, there's an enormous chasm between those two thoughts. But what is motivating them is the sense that, why is it that in the 21st century, America, America has people who somehow are not even worth $8. And I agree, I think that's scandalous. But at the same time, I showed you at the beginning of the talk, you saw the rate of high school dropouts among the labor force. You saw the rate of illiteracy among the adults. And, yikes, the scandal is not that those people can't get paid $10. The scandal is, how did we let those people get to be adults without a high school diploma and without the ability to read? How did we screw that up? That's the scandal.
Right, so it deflects attention to the real problem.
Yes.
Which is also the whole money system, because we wouldn't need ever-decreasing wages if we didn't have an ever-depreciating currency, right?
I'll disagree with that.
We have three more people. We have three more people in 3 minutes.
Oh, he left. I love fiat currency.
Okay,
Lee.
Lee.
I love fiat currency. I think fiat currency. What? I think fiat currency, and Mozart's Don Giovanni are like the two greatest things that civilization has created. So, quote me on that.
I used to debate Ron Paul.
That would not. I mean,
Lee.
I'm sorry, he's a politician. He has nothing useful to say.
Lee, quickly.
He's a doctor. That's the problem. Doctors think they know everything.
He's an economist, too. Okay, not a
Lee.
professor.
Lee.
You don't have to be a professor, but you go ahead.
Lee.
My points were covered, but you raised one about the fiat currency. Understand that its value rests in only one thing, and that's a politician's promise not to print anymore.
Yeah. It's astonishing.
You never promised that.
Ryan.
It's astonishing.
Thanks a lot.
No, it's terrific.
You never promised that.
It's terrific.
Are you a greenbacker?
Huh?
Are you a greenbacker?
What is that?
People who believe that forget taxes, just print money.
Oh, no.
The way the
Oh,
government
no.
Ryan.
That's
So, in terms of the currency, I'd say there are probably people at the Cato Institute to debate rather than somebody like Ron Paul, actually.
I imagine that's quite right.
Economist.
Yes.
But and actually, my comment was going to be related to what Jerry started to bring up about apprenticeships. Is that it seems as though in the past, that's a lot of how people learn job skills was that they did have low-paying apprenticeships because it's better to be paid even a small amount than to have to pay out to go to a trade school.
Yeah,
and so that's what people are being forced into now.
There's a delightful sort of nostalgia in the attachment to this sort of model of economics. This is manufacturing fetishism. Yes, when the economy was heavily driven by manufacturing, that was a model that may have made sense. We aren't like that anymore.
Manufacturing didn't require apprenticeships and whatever. They're very skilled trades that people apprenticed for. It wasn't for manufacturing.
So manufacturing, construction. Well, but basically, that was the economy of things, and that's the economy we had in the 19th century. It's time to recognize that most of our economy is not the economy of things anymore, and we all have this sort of, gosh, isn't it terrible that we aren't making physical objects anymore? And the answer is no. It's great that we're not making physical objects anymore. It's great that that is so small a part of our consumption. That's what economic development has brought us to, where there are so many glorious things that we can enjoy that are not tangible in that way. And when you think about the part of the economy that is not engaged in making things, the apprenticeship image is much less appropriate.
It is now 2:15, and so, Maeva, I apologize. I thought I saw your hand come up.
Oh no, I was celebrating. You said something glorious. I love it.
Okay, I would like to invite you, Professor Zax. I will send you email. I would like you to come back. I'm sure we have lots and lots of other things we'd like to talk to you about. This has been absolutely delightful, and I want to say thank you so very much.
I'm glad you appreciate it, and if you want to let my dean know, you should. That wouldn't hurt.
In point of fact, sir, could I ask you to please send me an email on that point? I'm being serious.
I will. I think, as I said, we should be more engaged, and one of the reasons we're not is that the university doesn't encourage us. The university doesn't encourage us in ways that would be helpful. So I will do that. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, should I turn off? Do you want to talk, Eva?
Yeah, you can turn that off.
Let's see if I got my son's card.
And so, do I want to turn things off, or do I want to keep recording? I will turn it off. So, hold on one second while I turn off the recording.